iHeartRadio presents Podversations, a weekly discussion with the biggest names and influencers in podcasting.
Hey there, and welcome back to another great conversation as part of the iHeartPodcast speaker series. I'm Will Pearson, Chief Operating Officer of iHeartPodcast. Each week we like to have conversations with one of our favorite creators, podcasters, thinkers in the space, talk about what they're up to, maybe what's going on in the industry. But it's not often we get a chance to have a conversation with someone who's been podcasting for many years now. And I guess as we talk about it sometimes around here, the pre-serial days, when you've been podcasting that long, you've been podcasting for a long time and actually help sort of define what the podcast industry would look like. But Michael Rapaport, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I mean, I'm not the pillar guys. There's guys that have really been doing it for a while, but, I feel like I got in before podcasts became like assholes and everyone has one. But I enjoy doing it. It's a totally unique platform. It's a totally unique expression. And it's just a fun way to communicate. It's a fun way to articulate. It's a fun way to express myself, to disrupt. It's unfiltered. It's uncensored. Yeah. You're the boss, and you're sort of the director, the editor, and the producer, and all that stuff. And from being an actor, primarily, and what I've done the majority of my adult life, you don't always have those freedoms. So I really enjoy doing it.
Absolutely. Well, it's obviously you've done it right. I think I saw the other day you've had more than 45 million downloads for the podcast. So that's no small achievement. It's pretty awesome to see that. And you're back in New York. What has that been like for the podcast? I mean, does it actually affect the podcast in any way to be back in the place where it all started?
No, it doesn't affect the podcast. I'm born and raised in Manhattan. I'm back in Manhattan full time. I've always had a place in New York City. I left when I was 19 to, become a stand-up comedian / actor. But my family's always remained here, and I've always had a residence here in New York. But I've left Los Angeles to be in New York full time, and it doesn't affect the podcast. It certainly affects me in a good way, and my family, and my wife, and I'm from here, and it's my natural habitat, and it's still a very inspiring city to me. There's nothing like it, the good, the bad, and the cold and the hot. But it's, for me, it's where I feel most comfortable, and where I feel, just most inspired on a daily basis. I'm not one of these anti-Los Angeles people, but I never feel inspired outside of when I'm working in Los Angeles. Like, I don't feel like the city of Los Angeles gives to you, whereas I feel like New York on any given day, on any given corner, you get things to think about, and that sort of resonate with you, and specifically with myself.
Yeah. Well, it's, we were talking just before we started rolling here about, some health issues you've been going through recently. And it's interesting in the podcast, something you don't see, I think, in just about any other medium, is to move from talking about something very personal to then talking about something happening in pop culture, to then talk about something happening in sports. I was listening to your analysis of the NBA finals recently that I was watching closely, and it feels like a medium that was sort of meant for you. And I'm wondering, if you go back to the early days and you started something that feels so casual, so informal, did you ever guess that this was something that could build this sort of following? Because it just feels like you're just sitting around having a conversation, or just talking about what's on your mind.
When I remember when the first podcast I did, and I was doing it alone, that podcast, and I've had different, I do sometimes with interviews, or sometimes a co-host, sometimes a guest co-host. But the very first one, when I was doing it alone, I would just remember being like, what the fuck am I doing? Like, like I'm in here talking to myself. And there's a skill, when you're doing the solo podcast, when I'm doing the solo podcast, there's a real skill to it. And there's a real certain amount of energy that I have to put into it. And, to sort of pose the question to the audience and then answer the question yourself.
Right.
You can't, assume the audience will connect all the dots. So I have to sort of, I'm pitching to myself and running and hitting it. But I didn't imagine, I didn't know what podcasts have changed so much in the last few years, in the business of podcasting and the exposure of podcasting, as you know, and I'm sure the listeners know, has changed. Like I said, everybody has a podcast now. There's, in my opinion, there's too many of them. I don't want it to turn into like MySpace pages. But, for me, I consider it a job. I consider myself a professional podcaster, and I take it, I take it seriously, and I take it as a profession, and I take it as a business, and I'm diligent about being on time, diligent about being on schedule. And, it's a service industry. I try not to make my podcast overly self-indulgent. I have parameters and sort of, things I kind of like to focus on, in regards to recently with the health stuff. The only reason why I was even sort of talking about it as personal as I was, because I had to cancel an episode, and I also had to cancel some stand-up comedy shows.
Yeah.
And also I just felt like, I say this on the podcast, I have a presence on social media, Instagram. I have a presence on Facebook and all those places, but that's a persona that I'm comfortable with.
Right.
And that persona, the fully disruptive behavior persona, is definitely on the podcast, but there's also a more intimate, more personal, more, dialed down version of myself that I only express on the podcast. I don't even express it as much on stage when I'm doing stand-up comedy. I express it as an actor emotionally, but the intimacy that I feel like I'm able to talk about certain things and feelings, and with my health stuff, is something that it's almost like a diary in a way. It's almost like a diary, because I feel like if you're listening to me on the podcast, you must be a fan. And if you've listened, throughout the years, you must be a fan. And, I just felt like, that it's important to share, what I'm feeling, what I'm going through, why I had to cancel episode, why I had to, why my energy might not be right, or why I feel like my energy might not be right. And also, as far as the ulcerative colitis, which is, spawn all the health things, I know that it's a sort of shameful disease. And I also know it's something that people that have it don't like to talk about. And, throughout the years when I was doing well, I always would talk about, going to the colonoscopy, because there is, as agonizing as it can be, there is a sort of dark gallows humor to going to get a colonoscopy. And since I've had them since I'm 17, I understand that gallows humor, but I also understand that, it's important to encourage, particularly men over 40, to do it. So that's my long answer to your simple question.
No, as we talked about before, I'm glad you're feeling a little bit better, and hope that continues. And it is great that you talk about it. Like you said, it's sort of in some ways, people are afraid to talk about things like that openly. So I certainly appreciate it. I want to go back to this idea you were talking about, that discipline or that diligence when you focus on publishing each of your episodes and publishing them on time. It's one of the things when I started working here in the podcast division, in talking to some of our most successful podcasters, particularly, one of our biggest, or actually our biggest, Stuff You Should Know, that Josh and Chuck host, they have talked about the fact that every Tuesday and Thursday for 13, 14 years now, without fail, they have published an episode. And you don't really think about the importance of that and sort of that level of discipline and preparation, but it sounds like you very much appreciate that. They talk about the fact that if they failed to publish an episode on one of those days, their fans would just lose their minds. But
Yeah.
it seems like a very important part of it. Talk a little bit about that if you don't mind.
I mean, when people ask me about advice, I'm starting a podcast, the first thing I say is pick a day. It could be Saturday at 6 p.m. It could be, Wednesday at 4 p.m. Pick a day and stick to that day. It's like must watch TV. Monday Night Football comes on at Monday. On Monday at 9 p.m. or 6 p.m. Pacific time. Laverne and Shirley used to come on at a certain time, and Friends would come on at a certain time, and the Howard Stern show comes on at a certain time, and and for me, especially when you're building, when you've built up a fan base, you don't want to disappoint the fans. I say on the podcast, you don't want to fuck the fans. You never want to fuck the fans. The fans could fuck each other, literally or figuratively, but I don't want to fuck the fans. And, my drop days, the drop days of the Rapaport Stereo podcast are Tuesdays and Fridays. And, we've been, I say like a 98% percentile of getting it out there, these amount of years, and, this 900 plus episodes. And it's important for me. I believe in being on time. I'm very, diligent and respectful of people's time in real life. And like I said, once you build up that audience, you don't want to disappoint, because there are many options. You don't want to lose the fans. And like I said, we're in the service business. And if you say Tuesday and Friday, come hell or high water, I really believe that we have to release Tuesday and Friday. Obviously there's exceptions. And you could articulate that, but I try to be, like I said, I think we're like, 95 to 100%, not 100%, we're 95, 98% throughout these years to get it done. And I'm happy about that and proud of that. And I also think it's, like I said, it's respectful to the fans, and it's also just like I said, it's a business. It's not a MySpace page. It's not a, Twitter page. It's not a Facebook page. I'm a professional podcaster, and the successful people are professional podcasters. And I'm sure they all treat it as such.
Well, you talk a lot about the fans, the Rapapack, as your fans are called. What is your relationship like with the fans? How much do you sort of pay attention to what they're asking about or wanting you to talk about from episode to episode?
I mean, I pay attention to them, and my producers, Jordan and Miles, the Dust Brothers, aka the Bleach Brothers. I would like more engagement. I would love to be able to communicate with them more, what they like, what they don't like. I never want to bore them. Like I said, I never want to be too self-indulgent. I don't want to overly be self-indulgent. It's a show. It's the I Am Rapaport Stereo podcast show. It is a show, as intimate and as personal it is a show. And podcasts are part of show business, and show comes before the business. Sometimes the business should come before the show, but it is a show. It's a performance. And I want them to be happy. I want them to be satisfied. I want them to be entertained. I want them, to provoke thought. I get a lot of DMs from them. We get emails from them. And like I said, I would love to hear from them more, the things they like, hear things they don't like. And, I love criticism, constructive criticism. And, even if it's not so constructive, like I like, if you spend time to listen to my podcast, I want to hear what you have to say, even if you disagree. And I think it's good to disagree. I don't think that the people that listen to my podcast, I wish there were more people that didn't agree with me on things more, because I listen to a lot of podcasts. I watch a lot of news, read a lot of news with people that I don't agree with, in regards to the more serious stuff and the political stuff, because I think it's important to hear points of views that you don't agree with, mm-hmm. and that you don't subscribe to. I truly think that's very important.
Mm-hmm. I do want to go back. You did one of your famous or your infamous AKAs when we were talking to a couple of our producers before coming on here today. Mm-hmm. One of them was saying, I want to know how that all got started, how you come up with those names. Do you come up with them on the spot? Sometimes I know, of course, many of them are recurring, but where did all that get started?
I grew up listening to radio in New York City, and some of the DJs had, they had great names, Mr. Magic, Chuck Chill Out. And, and then in the beginning of the podcast, it's just sort of, you just want to sort of introduce who you are. So, in the beginning of the podcast, it was Michael Rapaport, AKA, White Mike, AKA, this, that, and the third. And then the one that stuck the most, my wife gave me, and it was earned, not given. It was earned, not given. The one that I think people got the biggest kick out of was, this is Michael Rapaport, AKA the Gringo Mandingo. And then, the fans started giving me names and adding to that. And, then I would just sort of come up with one and say the White Chocolatito and the Jewish Jake LaMotta and the Jewish Brad Pitt and the Disruptive Warrior. So at the beginning, I'll just sort of riff off of some of them that we've come up with. The Gringo Mandingo is definitely the one that's, stuck the most. I believe a fan gave me the Raging Bullshitter because my favorite movie is Raging Bull. And I love that nickname, and, Mr. New York. And it's just a fun way to introduce yourself. And, I try to be consistent at the beginning of every show to sort of, set the tone and set the pace. Like it's a radio show. Like, yo, this is Michael Rapaport, AKA the Gringo Mandingo, AKA the Raging Bullshitter, AKA, whatever I'm, riffing off of. And sometimes, some people be like, well, what happened to this one? What happened to that one? I'm like, oh, I forgot, and I'm
those they're
like,
paying attention. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I feel like, I've left out some nicknames, and then I feel bad for that nickname. And then I try to give it the attention that it deserves.
That's pretty great. Well, let's talk a little bit about the sort of the live aspect. Obviously, you love being a live performer with the stand-up. You've done, I know you've sold out a 30-city tour with the podcast itself. Is that something you're thinking about doing? Maybe even connected to like the, 1000th episode, which is coming up in the not too distant future?
I would be totally down for it. I love doing the live podcasts. They're fun. The audience engagement is fun. There's nothing like performing live.
Mm-hmm.
When you're doing a live podcast, it's a little bit different it's more challenging than doing it, at the studio or at home. It's a little bit more challenging because, live, you have to, for me, I feel a responsibility. You want to keep it going. You want to keep everybody, engaged. So you have to give even more thought than you do when you're recording either an interview or when I have, my man Dean, co-hosting with me, or solo. But yeah, I would definitely do more live stuff. They've always been fun. The audience has always had a good time, and I've always had a good time doing it.
Yeah, that obviously comes through, and I know the fans would be excited. Is there any other way? I know you're not one for celebration if celebration doesn't seem necessary, but with the 1000th episode coming up, is there any other way you're hoping to recognize that?
Maybe for the 1000th episode, I'd reach out and have a guest or two, somebody special. The thing about guests, and I know they're great for business, but when I watch so many other podcasts and I listen to so many other podcasts, it's like we're sort of recirculating guests. There's certain people that, that do the circuit. I do the circuit, but there's like really, really, cool people that do the circuit, but it's just, there's so few people that I'm really, really, I feel like you could get people that bring in an audience and new listeners, and that's the business part that I respect. But I never want to interview somebody that I'm not genuinely excited to have, and that I'm not, almost nervous to have. I want to bring people in that I'm genuinely excited to talk to on one level or another. But I've thought about it. I know it's coming up. There's a couple of people that I would maybe like to have to play around for the 1000th episode.
Yeah. You've had some amazing guests on there. I was just looking back. I remember you had on one of our iHeart podcasters and radio talents, Charlamagne the God. I think
he was great.
At least
he's somebody who's always great to talk to, a lot of opinions, and obviously he's a professional, so he knows how to give a good interview. There's a skill to giving a good interview, and if I think if you're an interviewer like him, you understand, how to sort of edit and present a great interview. And he's certainly one of the best.
Well, he's one of the best and one of the most thoughtful people that we work with in terms of what he puts into every day. Well, before I let you go, Michael, maybe let's talk a little bit about, you've done almost 1,000 episodes. I'm hoping you've got many more to come. We are incredibly excited to have you joining our network, to join iHeartPodcast, and really excited to get behind this and help keep promoting it and keep growing it. But where do you see the podcast going? What do you want to do with the podcast that maybe you haven't done yet?
Man, that's a good question. I just want to continue to make every episode a genuinely emotional experience. I never want to fake or force an episode. I never want to fake or force a segment. My favorite episodes are when it's just like it's just a flow. Like it's just, if I'm flowing solo or I'm flowing with somebody else, where it's just a true flow. And to me, that's what I strive for every time I pick up the golden mic, as I call it. And, I want it to be an emotional experience. And, I say I leave blood on the mic, and it doesn't necessarily have to be dramatic. It could just be a funny riff. It could just be a funny rant. It could be a funny take. Like for me, the flow, the organic, the improv of the impromptu nature of how I like to present the I Am Rapaport Stereo podcast. That's my goal every single time. And, I want to continue to do that, continue to achieve that. I'm very excited about being at iHeart. So, we can continue to grow the podcast because, everybody loves their own podcast, but I know the I Am Rapaport Stereo podcast is special. I know it's unique. I know that it's brave. I'm very, very proud of the fact that, I've been very brave on the podcast and relentlessly brave. And I have a good time doing it. If I didn't have a good time doing it, I wouldn't be able to do it because the amount of thought and effort and care that I put into every single episode, it's like I said, it's a performance, and as a performer, you always want to try to achieve that perfect performance. I don't know if there ever is perfection, but there's sometimes I'm like, that was really good. And I'll say it on the podcast. Like, I know sometimes I'm like, this is fucking good. And I feel like it's good. And I could just hoping that the fans are, I think, the fans feel the same way certain times, and you try to achieve it for as long as you possibly can each episode.
No, it's fantastic. Well, like I said, we're excited to have you here. You can hear that passion come through for it. The work that you put into it. Looking forward to many more episodes to come. But Michael, thanks for taking some time with us today to talk a little bit about it.
Hell yeah, I appreciate it. And like I said, thank you for having me. And I'm excited to continue to build and kick ass on iHeart.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you guys for being here with us today. Hope you have a great rest of your week, and we will see you next time.
Podversations is a production of iHeartRadio. You can find more from the biggest names in podcasting on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you get your podcasts.